Good morning, everyone. My name is Ciel Vaughan and I work with Share Screen Africa. I'll be the host for today's event. Firstly, I wanted to say a big warm welcome to our students at TUT, Toronto University of Technology, who are the primary audience for this series. And also a very big welcome to everyone who's joining us online. We're really excited to have you. So this is the second installment of our series, Communication Skills for Conservationists. And just before we get started with introducing our speakers, I wanted to run you through what our key learning outcomes are going to be today. So we're hoping that by the end of the session, you will be able to understand the importance of stakeholder engagement and communication in conservation within Southern Africa, to recognize the complexities of communicating conservation objectives influenced by subjective, ethical, cultural, and philosophical values, to apply empathetic and crisis communication best practices to foster trust and meaningful connections with diverse stakeholders. And finally, to critically analyze a case study involving crisis communication and decision-making in wildlife management, balancing ecological impact with stakeholder needs. So that brings me on to our wonderful speakers today. So first of all, we have Dr. Lindy Botha. Lindy is a conservation practitioner with 25 years of NGO experience. She specializes in program management, facilitation, and organizational learning. She's got a PhD from UCT, and her research explores human-wildlife conflict, corruption in conservation, and the social dynamics that shape wildlife crime, power relations, and animal welfare within Southern Africa. Thank you so much, Lindy, for joining us. We're really excited to have you here. And our second speaker today is Dr. Christelle Antonitis. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. Christelle is a postdoctoral research fellow with the NRF Chair in Science Communication for Social Justice at Stellenbosch University. So thank you so much, both of you. We're really excited to have you here. Thank you for giving us your time and expertise. Really excited to learn, and I'm going to hand over to you now, Lindy.
Thank you for joining us, and a special shout out to our students in the classroom. So yeah, my name is Lindy Botha. I've worked in the conservation sector for the last 10 years. And for 8 years, I lived and worked and did research in the Greater Kruger area. I specialize in wildlife crime and working with different actors to find innovative ways to respond to wildlife crime, but also to communicate more innovatively about it. I finished my work with WWF in January, and I'm now with an organization called Conservation Synergies. And we work to find cutting-edge social science solutions to contemporary conservation problems. So what are we going to do today? So first of all, I'm going to encourage you all to do a bit of introspection because you can't successfully communicate outwardly if you're not very clear about your own mental model around topics concerning conservation and nature. So we're going to identify your own stance towards nature, and that will, of course, inform how you communicate about it. We are going to pay attention to the role of values and worldviews in conservation-related communication, and that will help us to recognize the importance of good empathetic and good crisis communication. And we're going to do a case study. We're going to throw you into the deep end around a very, very real case study that involved a crisis. And that will help you understand why communication is so important, and in the conservation sector, why it is so tricky. Right, so one of the key questions of today's session really is to look at this question. What do conservationists really do? And it seems like many of you already have a very good handle on the fact that a lot of that is stakeholder communication. So, on the left side, I've got a lovely picture of a rhino, and many people probably think that conservationists spend a lot of time in the great outdoors interacting with the natural world and wildlife. And that is indeed often the case, but it is not the only thing that we do. So the picture on the right is a very typical day in the life of conservationists working in places like the Greater Kruger, where we can say that the full-time job of anybody working in conservation anywhere, not just in Southern Africa, is stakeholder engagement and communication. And I bet you could say that of any job in any sector. Yet, I would argue that there is something about our sector, the conservation sector, that makes communication and stakeholder engagement very important, very vibrant, but very tricky. And I'm going to ask you just for a second to just by yourself, think about why that might be the case. Why is it so vibrant, important, intense, but also tricky? So conserving biodiversity is not just about a scientific or an ecological endeavor or a project. It is fundamentally guided by subjective, ethical, cultural, and philosophical values. And these values influence our decision-making about what nature is, who it is for, and how it should be managed. So I want you to, throughout this talk, keep thinking about these three questions. What is nature? Who is it for? How should it be managed? Because your answer to those questions will also determine how and with who you communicate about your work in the natural world. So there's no easy answers to this. There's no universally accepted answers, and people hotly contest these issues. So what is nature? For many of you, specifically if you belong to a particular socioeconomic class, if I say the word nature, this is perhaps what comes up for you, right? So you think about vast, beautiful areas where there's often wildlife, and you'll notice that there's something absent from these pictures. Maybe you can start thinking about that. And nature is something that, you know, there's a Land Rover there with people on a game viewer probably, and nature is something that we enjoy from afar. And in this worldview, humans are typically removed from nature. So, you know, I'm giving you a clue. What is missing from this view of nature? And you know, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, but it is a particular view, and it's not the only one. And these pictures are all from the greater Kruger area as well. We've got domesticated animals there. We've got the people in the yellow uniforms doing rangeland restoration outside the Kruger Park. Are they restoring nature? Is that the kind of story worth telling in the conservation space? You've got an elephant skin there lying next to the Kruger Park. An elephant was slaughtered by local community members because it damaged their crops. Is this a story you would tell? How would you tell it? And from whose perspective? Is that kind of behavior between humans and nature natural in your world or in your view? We've got a cow there in the Mupani veld just to the north of the Kruger Park, a state vet looking at a domestic animal, a goat. So what is nature? Is it always inside or outside the fence? You see up there, we've got the fence line of the Kruger National Park. So what do we consider to be nature? And what kind of human-nature interactions do we consider to be natural or desired? And I guess we can also ask ourselves if animals are only ever to be photographed and admired, or can humans utilize them? And if so, what kind of stories would we tell to promote these different value systems? So typically, you know, all of us fall within one of these three schools of thought, and sometimes it's a bit of a continuum and a mix. But typically, if you adhere to instrumental values of nature, it means that you view biodiversity through a lens of its usefulness, its utility to humans, such as its role in providing ecosystem services or generating income, say, for example, tourism. So I've got that picture there of a abattoir in Skukuza in Kruger National Park, where once upon a time they actually slaughtered elephants, and they can process very large mammals through there, and they shared the meat with local communities. Now then, other people have a more intrinsic view of nature, where we say that, you know, we recognize nature as valuable in and of itself, and it doesn't always have to be valuable to humans in order to be preserved. And this is very typically the kind of a hands-off model, where people that ascribe to this view don't necessarily support hunting and culling and things like that. And then we have a bit more of an and both relational perspective, where humans are part of the picture, and there's kind of a reciprocity, and there's connections between people and nature, and this perspective is perhaps a little bit more flexible. So I would always argue that your stance in terms of these three main value systems will inform what you communicate about nature and conservation management, what you don't communicate, who you regard as your key stakeholders, and which stakeholder needs you privilege or silence. So I'd love for us to, at this early stage of our talk, to agree on three things. So these things are that conservation is always about subjective values and worldviews where there's no universally agreed positions or answers. And when we talk about values and worldviews, these are things that we typically feel very strongly about. Yes, we think about it, but it also invokes a lot of strong emotions in us. And these strong emotions make communication vibrant and important, but also tricky. And we'll touch on that in our breakaway case study. In your conservation career, you will walk a tightrope between different stakeholders and their diverse worldviews and their values. And this talk will hopefully give you some tools and things that you will see you need to become very familiar with as you progress in your career and also within the position that you might already be in. So when we talk about diverse values and worldviews, it really points to the importance of effective and empathetic communication and stakeholder engagement, where it's not just about bombarding people with facts. Empathetic communication is the practice of understanding and sharing feelings of others while conveying messages with clarity, respect, and crucially, emotional intelligence. It involves active listening, acknowledging emotions, and responding thoughtfully to foster trust and meaningful connection. So that is what we all want when we do stakeholder engagement. We want to build trust relationships. We want to address people's concerns proactively before it blows up, and we'll touch on that again in our case study. We want to enhance collaboration. We want to improve decision-making and incorporate varied insights. Long gone are the days where protected areas are islands, completely cut off from the outside world. These days, decision-making has to be collective and inclusive. And we want to manage crises effectively, and we want to de-escalate tensions. There's no strategic planning process or no form of project management that you can do so well that you will never have a crisis on your hands. So the natural world is unpredictable and complex, and the social world is unpredictable and complex. And you can imagine how unpredictable and complex it gets when these two worlds are so deeply intertwined. And of course, we want to strengthen the reputation of our conservation agencies, our organizations that we work with. So these are, I guess, what we all want, and these are the good practices that we strive for. But of course, there's a real world out there with real world challenges, and we want to have these. We want the real world to intrude onto our ideals, so that we can learn how to adapt to these challenges as we will encounter them for sure. So we are going to share a case study with you that is based on something that really happened, that Christelle and myself was involved with some years ago. And this particular case study, we see it occur over and over again in a different way. So we thought this one is it's a really good one to get to the heart of these kind of issues. So our case study does concern a wild animal in the wild that gets sick. So there's a few things you need to know about that before we get into the scenario. So generally, when wild animals get sick in large reserves, the people who manage those reserves see these diseases as natural population regulators. So the managers would weigh the benefits of intervention, treating the disease against the potential disruption of natural processes. And people generally lean much more towards let nature take its course. Certain diseases require mandatory control measures and interventions, but the vast majority of the diseases that affect animals don't require this by law. Treating sick animals involves significant resources, interventions are often reserved for high priority cases like endangered species or for research purposes. So while reserve managers do sometimes treat sick animals, interventions are carefully considered based on ecological impact, species conservation status, and the available resources. Okay, so let's kind of roll up our sleeves and get into the nitty-gritty of our case study, and later you'll get an opportunity to talk about this in more detail when we do our breakaway groups. But I wanted you to get into the details of the case study before Christelle's session, because Christelle's going to talk to us a little bit about crisis communication. And I bet after hearing this case study, you are already going to start wondering, how does one respond to something like this? And some of the answers will be in Christelle's session. So the case study that we're offering here is a real-world example of how communication can become a crisis and how it erupts around conservation decision-making. And if you are a conservationist one day, you are going to be making decisions every day about how to manage the natural world, but also how to manage the interaction between the natural world and your stakeholders. This scenario occurred in a flagship South African Big Five nature reserve, regarded as a top safari destination in South Africa, Southern Africa. So this already tells you something about the media attention that a reserve like this is likely to get. So in the last month, a controversy erupted around the management of a pride of lions. Let's call them the Sand River Pride. So this pride is very famous and very popular. It has a Facebook page created by nature lovers and photographers. And this pride of lions have also been featured on the reality television show Wild Earth. The pride is now severely affected by mange. So mange is a disease that lives on animal skins caused by mites. They can cause intense itchiness, scabbing, and hair loss. Healthy lions can survive this, but in severe cases, it can lead to death. And especially if it's very dry and animals are already not in very good shape, the mange can really be quite serious. So what happened here? A renowned wildlife photographer visited the reserve and posted graphic images of these mange-affected lions on social media, with a very emotional appeal to the reserve manager to intervene and to treat the disease. Now, these are some of the pictures that were shared online. She also shared a number of pictures of, of the lion cubs that were affected by mange, and you can feel that you have a visceral, immediate response to these photographs, and they're actually very, very difficult to look at. And maybe just for a second, just kind of test and ask yourself what effect are these photographs having on me, and you can perhaps feel your emotionality around the issue rising. So the photographer's post was, obviously very popular on Facebook. She had nearly 5,000 Facebook followers who shared the story multiple times, who responded to it. So it got a lot of engagement. And most of the people who responded to it expressed outrage at and a frustration at the perceived inaction of the reserve managers. The reserve managers, 3 days after the first social media post, released the following media statement. I'm going to ask you to read this by yourself because I want you to pay attention to the tone of this, and I also want you to pay attention to your reaction to it. Okay, so you get the content, right? So there's specific things that reserve managers are trying to communicate to the public here, and these things are very factual. And the reserve management is also appealing to science. They talk about best practices in wildlife management, conservation science, and they talk about scientific principles, fostering long-term resilience within the ecosystem. So I'm not going to ask you to give formal feedback right now, but just note how you felt reading this statement, and then also think about how you felt when you saw the pictures of the lions that were posted. So now the reserve responded 3 days later And the sentiments expressed on the Facebook platform were overwhelmingly negative, and they again called for intervention, begging and pleading with the reserve management to do something, and also criticizing them severely for not treating the lions. So this led to widespread negative sentiment across social media platforms, including X, it was then Twitter, where the story reached close to 600,000 people. Now you can imagine what that did for the brand of this reserve. So the controversy was further amplified when Traveller 24 picked up the story and disseminated it broadly with headlines such as, famous game reserve near Kruger National Park says it does not plan to treat a number of lions suffering from a bad case of mange. I'm just going to share with you by yourself, just read through some of the Facebook posts. These were really good examples of people's sentiments that they expressed. Some of the people referring to the lions as poor little babies. Another commentator very powerfully asks, what kind of people are you, to the reserve managers? And you can see the emoticons most certainly tell a story. This sets the scene for you. I'm sure you're getting a feeling of what it might be to be in the hot seat of the reserve management. Imagine you were the communications manager or the marketing manager of the reserve, and you now have to deal with this situation. What would you do? And I'm going to leave you with that question, and I'm going to hand you over to Christelle, who's going to run through some good practices and tips on crisis communication. And then we're going to go into groups. We're going to discuss this case study. We're going to learn more about it, and we're going to come back and share some of our insights.
Hi, everyone. So lovely to see so many of you, and I just was going through the chat, seeing so many people from so many different places across our lovely continent, and also seeing some people have joined who have quite a lot of experience in the field already. So it would be really lovely to get your input, and maybe if you want to share with us some experiences you've had with crises you had to deal with in your day-to-day work. Where, say, your managers had to respond to crises and you weren't sure they did the correct thing. It would be a really good opportunity for you to share that, and we could maybe discuss in the chat too, thinking through different responses to that. Of course, with crises, there's not one correct response, but there are some really good principles we can follow when responding to crisis. It's a big field that you can spend years studying. I'm just briefly going to introduce you to a few principles that can be useful in your day-to-day work, because as Lindy also mentioned, it's not if a crisis is going to happen, it's when will it happen. It will happen, especially with social media where information spreads incredibly fast. It happens quite often, actually, dealing with crises. And then, of course, as always, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Christelle Antonitis. I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow in science communication. And I also have quite a lot of experience doing crisis comms work. My interest in it came from working for the president of Madagascar for a few years, where crisis comms was part of our everyday life. And I really got a big appreciation for how big a difference good communication can make in times of crisis. People often think crisis communication is propaganda and spin. That's really not the case. If done well and with empathy, like Lindy also stressed, this can really make a huge difference to how people feel about the conservation work that you do. And as you've already done your introductory course, you have learned that communicating regularly and often and really knowing where your networks are online and in the real world and communicating directly with those groups is critical. So at a time when a crisis hits, like with this incident, you immediately know where to communicate and what the sort of culture of communication is of the different groups. So that is a critical first step, really knowing who are the people in your network who engage with the work that you do. And yeah, let me just go to my first slide. Something that Lindy and I have really been trying to push people working in conservation is to pay close attention to the communication space. People are always like scientists, especially people I work with quite often, feel like, but that's not really my job. I'm here to do the science. I'm here to do the conservation. I don't want to communicate. But it is such a critical aspect of it, because if you leave it and just put your head in the sand and hope it goes away, what usually happens is the crisis explodes, and you can pick up some really intense reputational damage. So there are some 4 steps that are critical when developing a crisis communication response. The most important one is to really know who you're communicating with. And part of that is to do thorough planning. And you do that way ahead of a crisis actually happening. So you need to have in place a social media monitoring, listening tool or strategy. And that really means you have to watch all the different social media channels where people discuss topics related to the work that you're doing. And these may pop up in places you don't expect. So you sort of need to have a general strategy in place. And this is something you do consistently. If you work in a bigger organization, it's important as part of your planning to have a team together, and they don't necessarily need to be the communications team of the company. It's people who know a lot about different topics, and you usually put as diverse a team as possible together, who will pick up on people's biases and blind spots when developing your response. And your planning committee need to come up with potential crises you're likely to face in the work that you do. And you prepare a communication response for those likely crises ahead of the time. Because as I mentioned already, it's not when it's going to happen, not if it's going to happen, it is really when. So part of your planning should be to really think through and test out responses that you develop continuously. It's not something you do once, you put it in a folder, you put it away. Because the communication environment, the conservation environment, the political environment changes all the time. And as a conservationist, you need to stay on top of what's being said in the news, what's being said in social media, to do that planning well. So anticipating potential crises is really important. Practicing your plan over and over. And then, as I mentioned, monitoring consistently is really important. And then the second step is the alert phase. So if something does happen, it's like a match being lit. So this incident with the lions, as soon as there's a spike, and if you're doing your social media listening carefully, you would have been alerted that there was an uptick in conversation around this topic. And it's really like a match being lit. So you can't be hesitating at that point. You need to respond as soon as you possibly can. So you need to move quickly, almost immediately, because your time is always limited with a crisis. And it's also critical that you take control of the situation. And especially if you still have time, if you act quickly, you have time to retake control of the narrative. Because what happened here was the narrative got out of control. Management waited 3 days before they responded. By that time, conversation had lit up. Lots of people popped in. Almost 1 million people saw the post. And in social media, we know most people don't even comment. So if you have that high number of people actually comment, you can know for sure that a large part of the public are pretty upset with you at that point. It's really important to seek a lot of information at the time, but even though you may be quite stressed at that time, it's crucial that you demand accuracy. So look for the facts as you go along and be ready to be flexible and to adapt. So yeah, in terms of the alert, it's crucial to know what kind of tools you'll be using, who is responsible in your organization for the monitoring work. Everyone involved should be monitoring, but assign someone who is ultimately responsible for that task. You need to know where to listen. As I mentioned, you as a practitioner, you need to be quite aware of where the conversations are happening. Since you are well aware of the kind of work you do, you'll know what keywords are important to search for. So what do you listen for? Depending on what the type of work that you do. And then you need to also determine when you should listen. So there are usually, if you spend a bit of time looking at the conversation spaces, you'll pick up that people are likely to say, comment more after 5 in the evening or very early morning. So over time, you'll pick up the culture of the conversation spaces you look at. So that should give you a good indication of when to look. And also I have tools set up that give alerts when there's suddenly a lot of comments related to your organization or the topics that you monitor. The next step then would be to assess the situation, to determine how severe is this problem for me. Is there likely to be reputational damage? Are there legal issues involved? How many people are angry with us at this point? What are the facts surrounding this crisis? And then hopefully you've planned carefully for crises and you already know, you've planned, you've tested it, the kind of response or resolution that's required for your particular crisis. And yes, I also already mentioned, quite important to also look out if there's legal, regulatory, or ethical issues, and to consult with people with experience to help you to develop an appropriate response. And then finally, once you've done all of that, but remember, it's a matchstick that was lit, so you have very little time to do it well. Then you need to come up with what are the next steps you're going to take to deal with the situation. Critical to this is to have a key message and to repeat that message over and over again, but also to adapt your message as you get more information about the crisis that you're facing. So critical that your response is informed by facts. Your response needs to be empathetic, to not further inflame the situation. Always express concern for the affected parties. If people are really upset, express understanding for it. And where appropriate, say someone that's part of your organization was actually responsible for the crisis erupting, it is important in quite a lot of cases to apologize, and people appreciate it. Again, have a chat with your legal department too, just to make sure that you don't get into trouble with that. But 9 out of 10 times people genuinely appreciate the fact that people take responsibility for if they were at fault during a crisis. Show accountability. So you want to demonstrate that you will do everything possible in your power to assist, even if it's not your fault. Even if it is a pretty normal run-of-the-mill crisis, or you don't even perceive it as a crisis, you still need to express, show that you're accountable for what you're responsible for, and be proactive in your messaging there. And then also to be quite explicit about the steps that you will be taking to resolve the crisis. And as you go along, as you monitor the situation, and again, like I mentioned earlier, you have to keep monitoring the situation. With some crises, it dies down immediately if you respond. And with other crises, your response may inflame people's anger even more. That is actually the more likely outcome with social media. Don't go into a panic. That's pretty normal. Just keep responding, keep sending facts into the information space, and I'll give you a few tips on how to do it without sounding condescending. And update people regularly on what you are doing to resolve the problem. And then also think through of what are some of the communication opportunities we have with this crisis, because there are always opportunities. Show what remediation you're going to do, how you're going to fix what's broken. So for instance, you may want to communicate that this is actually a pretty normal thing that happens. Next time something like this happens, or we should consider maybe continuously informing the public about this type of thing that happens. So you can refer people back to blog posts, podcasts that you've created and put into your own media space in times of crisis. And also let people know what you are doing to ensure that something like this does not happen again. Those are just some suggestions there. And then in today's social media world and the current information environment we're all living in, we are very likely to come across a whole lot of misinformation related to conservation and to the science that a lot of you can see, a lot of you are practicing and the work that you do. So a good technique is to not immediately respond. Say you're a scientist, to not immediately go in, but you're wrong. These are the facts. So for instance, with the climate change debate, someone may keep repeating this false claim. We don't need renewable energy because the climate has always been changing. Your immediate impulse may be to want to correct it. But a good tactic is what they call the bypass technique, is to really focus on something very, very positive related to the correct facts. So for instance, instead of just going in with, no, you're wrong, emphasize that renewables are actually the cheapest form of energy. And I'm so excited about the possibility of paying less for my energy bill and having cleaner air. So that second response, that bypass technique, you're far more likely to have a positive response and from the public. Another good technique is to just say, oh, that's super interesting. Where did you learn that? So that kind of response, if someone comes with a utterly false claim, will immediately let people stop and think, wait, where did I hear this information? And with this, you get them to actually go and check their sources on the information. So they may say, oh, I found it online, or I heard it on this podcast. You say, oh, well, that's interesting because I've heard this. And that just opens the opportunity for having an actual dialogue rather than a debate where you have one position, the other position, and you're never going to meet. So the idea would always be to rather have a dialogue than a fight. And most people connect to outcomes that they've helped create. So if you send them to look for better sources or in the direction of better sources, they're far more likely to have a positive information seeking behavior after that. So yeah, those are two good tips you can use when addressing misinformation. Critical is judging or insulting someone, even if they are objectively not correct. It's unlikely to build the successful bridges we need for the work that we do. So take great care to avoid doing that, because we often see that happening in conversation spaces, and you may be very, very frustrated and just wants to vote for God's sake, please, this is the facts. Try not to do that. Take a step back, take a deep breath, and respond in a calm, measured way. So next up, we're going to let you come up with a better response to this crisis that this conservation group was facing. So the scenario that we've shared in the chat, you can all download it. Hopefully by now you've had a read through. What you're now going to do is go into your groups, and we would like for you to assess how severe do you think this crisis is and why. Is it a high-risk crisis, medium, low-risk crisis? Because, of course, that would depend your response. How long do we need to get the CEO to respond? Or can we just have our day-to-day communicators or conservation specialists respond to this crisis? You need to determine who's responding and how often and where. But focus specifically on how would you respond differently to the crisis. So you can highlight to us what you think this organization did wrong or was not ideal. It's not, like we said, there's not one response that's correct. You will all come up with a different response, and that's great because you work to the strengths of your group. and your communicators in your space. So we hope you have a lot of fun with this exercise, because you are quite likely to come across this kind of crisis scenarios in your work. And yeah, if you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out, pop it in the chat, and have fun with this. Lindy, do you want to add something?
Yeah, thank you, Christelle. So what I would also like you to do in your breakaways is think back to those three kind of core value systems we discussed earlier around different views of nature, right? So in this case study, there's different views of what nature is and how nature should be managed bubbling to the surface. And you can see in the groups on social media how strongly they feel about it, right? Because it's not just about a particular animal in a particular reserve. It touches on their fundamental worldview and deep values about what they think nature is and how nature should be managed. So it kind of goes back to that very first question I asked right at the beginning. Yes, we know communication is very important in every sector, no matter where you work, stakeholder engagement, front of mind. But I will always argue in our conservation space, there's these extra layers that just makes, make people respond in these evocative and these kind of explosive ways that perhaps is not always there in other domains. So think about what value systems do you see at play here in this case study, and why is it important for you to, as a conservationist, to learn how to identify these in your stakeholders and respond to it in a empathetic way instead of trying to correct it, as Christelle mentioned. So thank you. Yeah, so I'll stop sharing and then we'll all be lobbed into different groups and the people in the classroom will tackle this together.
Welcome back, everyone.
Hi, everybody. Are we ready to tackle the questions? Okay, I hope we made you sweat a little bit. And like I said in the beginning, we really are throwing you into the deep end of a very complex but very real scenario. So when we give feedback, we will have time for about 4 groups. Hopefully we can get in responses from 2 of the student groups, and then our online audience also 2 groups there. I'm going to ask you to limit yourself strictly to 3 minutes in your feedback. So one of the key skills of communication is to be succinct, and you can practice that now. And we're going to ask you to spend more or less than a minute on each question, starting with the questions Christelle posed earlier around assessing the situation. And then you'll see that her question and my last question are very similar. So given what you've now learned about crisis communication, what would you do differently? So you can start off with answering how severe do you determine the crisis to be and why? And then you can respond to this first bullet point, and then around what you would do differently. Is there any group with a burning desire to give feedback? And we love that, by the way, if that is the case. So don't hold back. Wonderful to see some colleagues from the greater Kruger here. Vusi, will you give feedback on behalf of your group?
Yes, so thank you very much for the
And
opportunity.
Your 3 minutes starts now. Sorry, I'm going to be very specific around timekeeping.
No, that's a lot of time, no worries. All right, cool. So in our group, when we look at the first bullet point, we agreed that this is a crisis indeed. And one of the things when we look at the case study is also going back to saying that the Pride of Lions, that they are actually having their own Facebook page and they are out there in the global space. So them being known, it means that when people visit your reserve, they will want to see them, they will want to photograph them. And as a reserve, you want to give the best experience to people. So with allowing your guests to go there and see them at that state was quite irresponsible in a way of the reserve. And so it led to that situation exploding. The second point that we also discussed was also the point that you know, when the photographer took that picture, especially with a lot of international people, there are many times where they take pictures and then it gets blown out in social media into people that are not in that room, in that space, what we call couch conservationists. Some people will even go as far as raising money to make sure that there's a campaign against you or against your work. So you actually create even a bigger crisis to your situation. And the last point that we looked at was also saying that, you know, we wonder if that picture was even sent to the management of the reserve to notify them that we've actually seen the lions not in a good position before going out into the public. And then what we would have said, what we would have done differently, which is the second bullet point, or good communication. We came up with a statement that says, we are aware of the pictures and reports that are going around on social media about our pride. We have consulted with our technical staff and vets to assess the situations. The condition being photographed is called MAGE, which is a skin disease caused by mice. We apologize for any inconveniences and unpleasant experience caused by these situations. We'll closely monitor the recovery and healing process as we do everything in our power to these lands, and keep everyone up to date about that. That's it from our team.
Okay, Vusi, thank you. I'm just going to ask you a follow-up question. So in your team, was there a sense that communication is about communicating facts, educating the public, or was there also a sense that it's about storytelling and engagement and meeting people where they're at in terms of their value systems?
Yeah, so you can communicate facts, but not all of it. So like the policies that they were talking about, those are facts, think systems that are there, but it was all about responding and managing expectations, and also perspectives that people might have. So to make sure that you ensure people that you have everything under control and you are a trustworthy organization, or you've got the best people on the ground. So making people feel safe as well.
Great. Yeah, so as Christelle mentioned, it's not that we're not talking about facts, but it is the how, in how we talk about it. Great, brilliant. Thank you. And thank you for being so succinct.
Lindy, can I add something real quick?
Oh,
Thanks, Lucy.
sure.
That's really great. And something I forgot to mention, which you touched on there, is if you let that time go and you forget to communicate, people will fill it with their own information and own action. So if you don't act, they will act. So like you said, you can make that crisis so much bigger by not responding. So people start forming those groups, petitions, and so forth. So that's a really great point. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, so through our inaction, we actually create platforms for people to push kind of their own agendas, whether it's animal rights activism or whatever it might be. So if you do nothing, you are not doing nothing. You are actually enabling a whole bunch of things to fill the space where you should be in. Thank you. Yeah, who's up next? Shall we do another online group before we go to the classroom? I see a hand from
There's a
Lauren.
volunteer, Lindy. Lauren.
Lauren.
Hi there. Thanks so much for the opportunity. Just to add that I work alongside Vusi, so we are part of the same team, but we were in different rooms. What we discussed is more around the action. We didn't go too much into detail on assessing the severity, but my assessment would be that the situation is severe. It's hitting a large audience very quickly, and so early intervention is critical. In my experience, people turn to outrage very quickly, particularly on social media. And if there's anything that feels like it might give rise to that, a very quick intervention is important. And I think the mistake that was made here is that the response was very much from a science background, which is accurate, but they ignored the human element. And if you look at the public who was reacting here, you've got nature lovers, patrons of the reserve, guests, and a lot of those people don't necessarily have a science or conservation background to understand the reasoning behind that. So my feeling is that the first step should always be to acknowledge the human factor in the situation. Thank that audience for their deep care for those animals and for their reserve, and to bring them into to feeling that they are contributing to the solution. I would then explain the science behind the decision that they've taken, which is no action or non-response, which is still a response, but use very different terminology to explain it, to try and make it more understandable to a broader audience, as well as acknowledging that it's a terrible situation for everybody to sit by and watch, including for the team. The team is also on the ground, contributes people who care very deeply, and so they don't find it easy to take this response of no action. And then inform the public as to what monitoring is going to be done going forward, that they're not just sitting and leaving those lines, that they will be checking whatever those steps might be, inform the public of that, and then follow through with updates to the public to keep them up to date, because this audience is now involved, they care, and so you don't want to create a situation where they feel that the story is being hushed up. I think that would just further add fuel to the flames. And then I think the final step is actually to follow through with that reporting, make sure that you deliver on that.
Yeah,
That's excellent, Lauren. Yeah, you touched on a lot of really important factors to keep in mind with this kind of thing. One thing I'd like to add is the social media algorithms are designed to promote outrage. That's
Absolutely.
why, so for you as the communicator to calm the situation down as quickly as possible is critical. So you are kind of up against the technology in this instance.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much for the opportunity to contribute.
Right.
Great. Thank you, Lauren, and the good people from the K2C representing. Something I also, maybe Christel, if you can just mention it, your view on this. So, you know, some of the research we're busy with right now in terms of human-wildlife conflict and how people talk about it on social media, we notice that as South Africans, we're very quick to follow narratives around conspiracy theories. And Lauren mentioned, you know, it's important to step into the space, fill it with your perspective as an organization, because if you don't do it, before you know it, some sort of conspiracy theory is very likely to evolve around how the reserve doesn't care. They're only there to make money out of tourists. And actually, we did see posts like that. But Christel, I don't know if you want to say something about our tendency to jump onto the conspiracy bandwagon.
Yeah, it's almost become a habit, and I think because information spreads so fast on social media, if you're not extremely proactive with your communication and you establish yourself as a trusted source in that communication environment, if you're not there, then you will see those conspiracy theories, the misinformation, just running out of control. It's almost inevitable. So we cannot overemphasize how important it actually is to make sure that you establish yourself and people in who you work with as trusted sources. And there are diverse opportunities. Some conversation spaces are just extremely toxic, and it's sort of become the culture of the space to just slash down in any form of conversation. So that's why it's important to communicate in different places. So have avenues where you can have a more in-depth discussions, for instance. Because some social media platforms, you limit it to like 140 words or something. So that might not be the ideal space. to have an in-depth conversation, but you can link to an in-depth conversation.
Great. Thank you. I see a hand from Calvin. Calvin, are you representing a group that wants to give feedback? Because we can sneak you in real quick before we
Yes,
go to the classroom.
yes, feedback.
Okay, Calvin, you've got to nail it in 3 minutes. No pressure.
Wow. So the first point was about the response from the manager. Could it just be a pretense that is showing sympathy to the Lions? That the audience felt like. The other one could have been escalated because of the bad relationship between the management and the community or the people. Simply because there could be some underlying issues that were not resolved before. And now the audience or the community felt that this one, like they felt that one would be the best way to go in terms of addressing the issue of the Lions. The other one was maybe it could have resorted from a dishonest photographer that framed the images and shared to social media. Because you can see that, like, why did the photographer not share any other images of the healthy pride? He or she chose to share the only unhealthy lions. So there could be some sort of dishonest photographer. The other one could be because of the nature of lions. Like the photographer felt so sorry for the endangered species. That's why they went ahead and posted on social media. So the other question was about how I would do if I was sitting in the desk of the manager. One, I could not have waited so long to respond to the cry. I would thank the photographer for bringing the issue forward, and during that time, I would, as a manager, I would share an hotline that people could share any information related to the same through a hotline, let's say an email or a phone number, so that the issue does not get to the public before it gets to the manager. In that case, I would be giving the people a sense of ownership. That is not the manager's responsibility to keep it's not the one who is owning the alliance, but it's a resource that is owned by everyone, and everyone is responsible for coming forward and sharing any concern. The other one is it's about I would find out how to get a vet on board quickly and share images, replying to the same to the public, showing that the issue has been received and something has been done. And also, as a follow-up, I would continue sharing the images on how the now treated lions are doing. So just to keep the audience posted. I think that was what, as a group, we thought.
Yeah, I like your group. Your group really emphasized action and doing things proactively, something like a hotline, for the welfare of the animals inside the park. I think that could most certainly work because these parks are huge. And I think the public doesn't expect managers to be able to, to know what's going on every square meter. And something like that could make them feel they're part of it, they get input, and there's a response. Anything from you, Christine?
I strongly agree with that. That's a great one that you emphasize there, Calvin. That call to action, people respond with outrage because they care. So you want to give them an opportunity to actually participate, like make them feel like they're doing something to address the situation. And you can guide what is the most appropriate action they can be involved in, whether it's just raising funds for the reserve, whatever works in that case. You gave a few great examples. And I see Vusi's mentioned in the chat that never underestimate the power of an image to capture a situation, and this is why the situation exploded. So you, as a response, can also, of course, respond with powerful images, showing what you're doing to remedy the situation. So yeah, great contributions, everyone.
Yes. Yes, and I think, Christel, what you mentioned about responding with, say, for example, a photograph, many of our conservation managers would feel compelled to respond with science, right? And facts. So Calvin mentioned that in this case, the audience perceived those scientific facts. They equated that to not caring.
Yes,
right?
because it comes across as cold.
Right, because of the tone and the way that it was communicated. So the way we share the science, there's many different ways in which science can be shared. And remember, science is not a thing without emotion. It doesn't have to be. So there's many ways that one can harness facts or the truth or scientific information. Something I want to follow up, Christel, about you've mentioned now a few times, this audience cares. And we've seen this often in the conservation space, where people respond with such passion and often with outrage. In many ways, this is capital. This is gold for people working in conservation, right? So, and we
It's that opportunity in the crisis. Yeah.
right. There's this huge opportunity, but we have a tendency to immediately respond negatively and defensively towards this audience. But these are people that care deeply. And can you imagine if one could, through long-term engagement, influence this audience to bring them a little bit closer, perhaps to your value system, so that care and that passion could be better harnessed, right? So I put that out there.
Yeah, I just want to add that Kiara's added a great comment in the chat section, that management could also have been more on it proactively before someone took the picture, like move the lines, or maybe just communicating, we have this situation, it's normal, or we are dealing with it, but this is our stance before, and then that would have immediately cooled down that conversation before it happened, in a sense. So yes, that is a great contribution there, Kiara. Thank you.
All about being proactive. Okay, we have to be proactive and go to our students in the classroom. We haven't forgotten about you guys. What have you got to tell us? The first, so we've got 2 groups reporting from there. Great, you guys have 3 minutes. We want to be bowled over by what you have to say.
Okay, yeah. So we thought that the situation was quite severe, since it looked like it was a private game reserve, not a provincial or national park. So their funding is mainly tourism, stuff like that. You could already see that some people say that they will tell their friends overseas that they should not come and visit the park anymore. You can see that people are striving to almost create a boycott for the reserve to stop all tourism, because people do act quite emotionally and stuff like this. Therefore, we also thought that it's important, if you talk to an audience who act very emotionally, that you must at least sound a bit more empathetic, so that they feel like you also care about the situation. Because of course, the people working in the reserve, they dedicate their whole life to this. They don't get paid a lot. They're the one who struggles and works every day to run the place. So there's not a problem with their heart. It's just the way that they communicate it that the people understand wrongly. Therefore, we do think that it's important to just sound a bit more empathetic. Because the effect is quite detrimental if everyone stops coming, because then the reserve cannot function anymore if they don't have any funding. Let me quickly check what else we said.
Sure, and while you take your notes, I think what is important to know, and you're spot on around how vulnerable private reserves are because of their funding model. But of course, we also see this kind of pressure and response to provincial reserves and sandparks, government reserves. It's not just happening in the private domain. Thank you.
Yeah, so we think that it's also important for the reserve to remain with the integrity that they run the reserve according to their policies. They cannot just change everything. So it would be better to just explain the reasoning behind their decision-making process, because stuff like mange, it's very expensive to dart an entire lion pride and treat it, and I don't know where they will find that funding, and it's not even guaranteed that it will have 100% success rate if they do it. Another problem is, and I want to see my point again. So yeah, it's just important for them to understand the reasoning behind the decision-making process, because it also has some benefits. If like the reserve might have a problem with inbreeding, those lions might have weaker immune systems, and disease is a natural disease that's not anthropogenic, is a way to control to reduce the weaker genes in the pride, and so you can bring in new blood and stronger genes and maintain the integrity of the gene pool, if it makes sense. But yeah, I'm not certain exactly the way that they did handle it, but we think it's very important to remain with the integrity that you usually run the reserve, and you cannot just change everything because someone is upset with it, but you have to act in a way that you won't lose your funding, so you can still run your reserve, because that is, at the end of the day, that's the most important thing. You cannot be stubborn and then you don't have a reserve anymore.
Right.
Thank
No,
you.
Cannot be stubborn.
you make several great points there. And I think it is so important to never underestimate how little people that comment quite a lot on conservation pages, and how very little they actually know about the realities on the ground. What it's like, why it's, because you'd see one paper we're currently working on where an elephant got out of the Kruger. The high number of people who just said, oh, but you just need to dart them and carry them back in. No one they even considered, well, this is extremely expensive process. It doesn't make sense to use your limited resources in this way. But there was no one communicating from conservation side at all on the incident. And that's why it's so important to just inform people, because they really know extremely little often.
Yeah.
Yeah, we also thought it was very important to just inform the manager, or whoever you can inform in the reserve, of the mange, because they might be aware, but they might also not be aware. People working in nature conservation, they don't have time to scroll through Facebook all day and say, oh, we have a problem here and everyone is angry. So that would also give them more time to get a quicker response out to the public and not wait 3 days, because it is quite difficult to know what's going on social media if you out in the field trying to fix stuff.
No, 100%. I agree with you, but that's why we keep repeating why it's people often feel like, no, I don't have the time to deal with the social media nonsense. But then when the crisis hits, it can actually sink your reserve.
Yeah.
When people start petitioning. So it is crucial that you have some kind of a plan in place for someone to monitor it. We can't expect everyone to monitor it consistently, but you do need a plan.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you. That was great.
So thank you. I think your group, to me, what I hear is a emphasis also on the educational aspect of our communication, which goes back to, yes, we have to learn how to communicate facts, but we have to learn how to package in a way that it's engaging to people, and that they don't feel patronized, because that was one of the main problems we had with the statement that the reserve manager put out. We talk about empathetic communication, but I think as a group, we should also reflect just for a brief moment on the position that reserve manager is in, right? So this was something that unfolded during the whole kind of rhino poaching crisis that was at its height at the time. So you can imagine how busy this reserve manager was with something like security issues and, you know, incursions into the park, etc. And probably being a little bit more of an old school person that wasn't trained on the social issues around conservation, never got one day's training on the importance of communication. So often people have to kind of fly by the seat of their pants, and they've got to improvise. And, you know, when you go and you start your career, or whether you're already in conservation, all of us constantly, we need to advocate for more capacity building amongst people working in conservation on communication, because you'll find everywhere you go, you'll be hard pressed these days to find a single conservationist who doesn't agree with the statement that communication is important. But you go to their budgets and you know, the things that they spend their time on, conservation is often, communication is often right at the bottom. So there's a lot of lobbying and awareness work and advocacy all of us need to do wherever we work around the importance of communication, and also to really understand that people who manage reserves, who manage large NGOs, small NGOs, they have a very difficult job where they've got to juggle multiple stakeholders with multiple values, and they've got to find a way to communicate engagingly and proactively and empathetically with all of them. Next group, our last group from the student room.
Morning, everyone.
Hello.
So our group thought that this was a very severe issue because to the public eye, it may seem as though the reserve management is being neglective of their wildlife, of the condition of the health of their wildlife and the animals. And while someone might look at social media and be like, oh, I don't have time for social media or what's happening on social media, it also is a form of communication because it's how your reserve communicate with a broader audience on the globe, like all over the world. But what the public does not know is that the reserve has policies that they are required to adhere to that prohibits them from treating or performing any intrinsic management practices on the pride in question or any form of wildlife existing within their premises. So they have to follow policies that says that if the disease occurred naturally, you do not interfere and you practice intrinsic management. The second, how would we respond differently to the crisis is that we would create a bigger platform where the broader masses can be equipped with knowledge on how the treatment and regulations on the health of the wildlife operates, that you can't just treat an animal just because it's unwell and looks unpleasant to the eye. My group and I made an example with chickenpox, which is something that we would say is rather inevitable or something that almost happens to almost every human being. That happens to almost every human being and every human being goes through at some point. Except humans get humans get immunized, and we have our immune systems ready to tackle the disease when it attacks. Hence, the effects are not as lethal as we see on the pride of the lions. So what we think must be done is we must create platforms to educate people on how the reserve management tackles or responds to the matters as such. Not just release a Facebook post to let the public know that there's nothing you can do about that, as that opens room for more outrage from the public and backlash. The response from the reserve management, we think, was extremely dismissive, and it feeds into the ignorance of the public.
Well
That's
said.
it.
Great, thank you. Some really fantastic contributions from all of you. Congratulations. I thought you might struggle a little bit to come up with good responses, but not at all. And I really, it's so heartening to see how deep you all think about these things and come up with quite practical responses. I also see Julia's added a comment in the chat saying another critical example how the northern world looks at the southern world, as if we still live indigenously in huts, fetching water and not modern, just because of the cultural pictures that circulate on the internet. That is such an important point, Julia, that you're making there. And that is also part of our jobs as conservationists, as communicators, to challenge those stereotypes. And working in conservation, you have absolute gold that you're sitting on to communicate on social media. And you guys who are becoming experts, studying, that's a strategy you can think of to make yourself known as someone who is knowledgeable in that area. One thing that none of you picked up on is how extremely boring their response is. It's just a whole block of text. And
Mm.
and if you communicate in a boring way on social media, no one's going to pay attention. People are going to get angry. So there are lots of different strategies that you can follow to have an engaging, fun presence when communicating, even very serious topics. And that is how people adopt it best. If you're communicating science, you want to communicate it in an engaging, fun way so people will actually pay attention to it. So yeah, seems easy, is not always, but you sit with such rich material to work with.
Yeah.
And it's massively underutilized. And if we are not communicating to challenge those stereotypes, who will? Then again, there's a vacuum in the conversation space, and it's filled with those nonsense from abroad.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Christel, we also saw that with the research we're doing right now. So last year, an elephant escaped into the kind of broader Hazy View area, and SABC had a short clip about it and posted it on Facebook, and 2,200 people responded to it. Can you believe it? I mean, again, gold. Many other pressing issues in our country.
2.4 million views.
2.4 million views, right? So many other pressing issues in our country just cannot garner that same public interest. And with conservation issues, it's just like that. But interestingly, out of the many comments, there was not one from a single credible organization in the greater Kruger area. Many of the comments we were very happy to see from local people, and they really made some very vibrant contributions. But there were also
And
many
hilarious.
comments, very funny ones, really harnessed humor in a wonderful way. But also many comments from abroad that just showed that people had absolutely zero understanding of the context. So the question we always ask is, who's having the conversation, and how can credible voices, and many of you on this seminar, you are those credible voices, and how can we see more of you influencing the conversation in a proactive way?
We need to
Yes.
get to the Q&A.
Yes, right. So I'm going to move away from the questions. Thank you to the groups. Thank you to the people in the audience online and also in the class. So yeah, we're going to have time for a little bit of a Q&A. But just to wrap up the kind of takeaways, I think, and I'm very happy here that we're preaching to the choir, but conservation is fundamentally about communication. So if you're studying conservation because you want to get away from people, you're in for a bit of a surprise. And you'll be constantly interacting with diverse stakeholder groups that need constant and consistent engagement, and they will have diverse values. And these diverse values are the source of our very strong views and our emotions when it comes to issues in the natural world. And empathetic communication and crisis communication will be a key, I almost want to say, standard aspect of your work. And crisis communication will be a routine part of what you do. And with that, I am going to hand it back to you guys, our audience. I want to ask, is there perhaps somebody that can share an example of a successful communication campaign or a response? I think in the conservation sector, we can get very bogged down by, the challenge and the outrage and the algorithms that we're always up against. But there's also so many stories of people influencing conversations, influencing public perception, and promoting their brands really well. Okay, so we have some ways to go to mine those good positive case studies, and maybe we can do that in a next in a following iteration. But for now, any particular questions or other comments?
Yeah, so those of you who are in our online audience, feel free to put questions in the chat, or if you'd like to ask them live, you can use the function to raise your hand or just turn on your camera and wave. And then Marika as well, if you've got any questions there in the TUT classroom.
Hi, no, from our side, there's no questions at all.
Okay. what about our online audience? I'm not seeing anything just in the chat yet, but we did have a really fantastic discussion just now, so I think people can be excused for not asking questions. Do you have any more comments, Lindy or Christelle? Oh, hold on, we've got a question online. Perfect. Vusi, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, I'm sure also Lindy saw that coming. So now my question is, and I think from listening to everything that we're discussing today about good communication, I would just have a question around what do we say about those guys that, yeah, are sitting somewhere overseas and constantly going through the different posts out there and making uninformed comments and campaigns. And I would give another example with the recent elephant culling that took place in Zim in Botswana last year due to the hunger and everything that was happening there. I'm sure that had a huge backlash from the international community, as much as information was being shared why they're doing that, the relevance of it and all that. And even though they kept on ensuring that the elephant numbers were also doing very well, but you also have those people that are emotionally connected to certain species that we end up calling them tree huggers. So how then do you speak to that? Is there a time where you need to ignore such things, or is there a way where you can still address that?
Yes, a great question. And those are the kind of challenges you are likely to face. There are no easy answers. And with something like that, where elephants are involved, it's like the most mediatized animal, maybe in the world, definitely in Africa. So people have very strong feelings about elephant. There's so much written about it. So when you have to make difficult decisions around and no one agrees 100% on it, communicating around having to do something like that is very, very difficult. And you need to think through quite carefully as the communication planning team, because you are going to have to do something like that. So this is a perfect example of where it would be extremely important to have a whole campaign planned around it, because you will get those reactions. And to keep communicating on what you're doing, why you will get the negative responses. That's inevitable. You will get the ignorance, but you still need to, that doesn't mean you just disappear and not speak. You need to establish yourself as that trusted voice, and people will step up for you. If you go and look at some of those Kruger groups, people are extremely passionate about sort of protecting and that is a massively under harnessed resource. So you get a lot of people to communicate it, and people won't agree, but get them to have a conversation about it instead of just fighting. That would be the dream, but it's very challenging.
Yes. Christelle, just a comment, quick one from my side. I know we're wrapping up, but I think we Africans are very good at using humor. And we also saw that with that very case, Vusi, that you mentioned around the elephant culling and the elephant numbers and this whole debate around what to do with all these elephants we have in Southern Africa. So one of the, I think it was the president of, was it Namibia? Botswana, who kind of suggested that, they were going to send all the elephants, the surplus elephants to London and Berlin, and there were very soon all sorts of funny memes with Boeings and elephants sitting and having the chicken or beef in the airplane, and these memes were circulated very widely. People picked up on it, and it struck a chord with a larger online audience, that just again giving people scientific facts about elephant numbers and population control, etc., just would never have gotten that kind of message across. So I think that we can learn a lot from what works, from good real life examples, and it is really time for us to think outside the box, because often your critics and some people that that want to see our conservation agencies fail. They think outside of the box. Why can't we? Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Lindy. I think that's a really fantastic place to end on. I'm just going to put our learning outcomes up on the screen now, just while we close up so that we can be reminded of what they were. I'm really hoping that everyone found that they have learned this and more in today's session. So I wanted to say a massive thank you to everyone for joining. Thank you to our online audience and our wonderful TUT students as always. This was a really fantastic discussion and super engaging as well. So thank you so much to our wonderful speakers. We have got another talk coming up in the series, the last one, which will be on the 16th of April. And that is presenting yourself with confidence, the art of personal communication. And the talk that we had last week will also be up on our website. I think Murat will post the links in the chat at the moment. There's a part 1 and 2 for those because these discussions are quite long. But I just want to say thank you so much. We've had a really amazing event today, and thank you to our wonderful speakers. We look forward to seeing you all next week.